Okay. I'm not actually going to start smoking this. Just a little tribute to Calandale, who frequently smokes in his videos. I enjoy smoking a pipe. There's no tobacco in this one though, because I don't smoke inside. I have before, but not in our new house since we got new carpet. So I'll have to wait till the weather gets a little nicer. On to Paris. This is one that I've been waiting for a long time. It was actually in development longer than originally intended. It was maybe a year, maybe 2 years. Maybe not as long as 2 years, but at least a year of additional development beyond when it was originally scheduled to be released. I was so excited at the prospect of a game, another game using the old Victor Games Civil War system. And I hesitate to even say system because I don't think any other game has ever used that Victor Games Civil War initiative differential theater command points type of system. Trying to rack my brain. I don't know. If somebody out there knows of another game that used that, I might be interested to hear it. But this one was so exciting because it was both on a topic that is not covered very often in war games and using a system from a game that is known and loved and is considered one of the kind of shelf staples of the wargaming hobby. So what we ended up getting was definitely something that had its basis on the Civil War system, but had what I would call a lot more chrome to it and more complexity to it. And to both good and bad ends, I think. I already did an earlier video, and when I first started my playthroughs, lamenting the fact that so many of the initiative differential and your command points and your reinforcement points, you've got like 20 counters, 20 little chits worth of stuff that you're tracking all on one general records track, which is just kind of a mess. I ended up adapting what Calandale used. I think he offloaded his reinforcement points to the railroad point tracks, which at least got 10 counters or so off of that general records track, so the general records could be mainly just your initiative point differential and your command points. And that worked reasonably well. But it did definitely make me miss the Civil War system of having individual command point tracks and individual initiative point track. But that takes a lot of space, and this game is already very space intensive because it's got many player aid cards that you're using to track your armies, your corps, and your various reinforcements and penalty tracks and stuff for each side. So each side has 3 player aid cards that you're already tracking stuff on, which is already space intensive. So all those player aid cards stacked together use up just as much, if not more, space than the Civil War's tracking grid system. So there was that issue with the components. I didn't have any problem with the map. It was maybe not the most precise map in terms of the artwork for the terrain, but the colors were fine. It was vibrant, and I'm fine with that. I'm not a slavish adherent to the old Redmond Simonson school of anything that's not mountains or water is going to be tan, or or that's not woods is going to be tan or this sort of off-white color. I'm fine if you want to have green, big green map. So that didn't bother me. The fonts on the counter artwork was nice on the counters, and I love, like, a lot of the game was done in this kind of I don't know what sort of font this is or what kind of script this is, but to me this looks like the colors with the gold and the red and the type of font that it is. This looks very Victorian age, like not. It looks very mid-19th century to me, like not even late 19th century, but mid-19th century. I don't know why. I have no idea if this is actually a font that you would have seen somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, but it certainly feels like it, and I love that in Warning. The cover art's great too. This is a very awesome dramatic picture here of Prussian troops climbing over the wall in a city. I don't know where that's actually at, but it's pretty cool. So I generally liked the artwork of the game, this theme that had a very 19th century feel, all the artwork to it. But the counters were not super functional in terms of legibility. And I think Enrico said this in his review that, aside from being clear on which side's counters you're actually looking at, the only other piece of useful information on the core counters is the name of the core, and it's in this super tiny font that you can't see. So, that's something that could have been done much differently. But those are my biggest gripes about the components, and I think they're probably going to be typical. The other one being on the player aid cards, and again, it used this particular font, and it's probably not going to be clear here at this distance anyway. But all the font on these player aid cards, it's not the font that was really the problem, because it uses the same font on the Prussian player aid cards, which is perfectly legible. It uses the same font on the French player aid cards, which is mostly legible, except when it appears against this light greenish background that all these player aid cards are on. They use this drop shadow on the font. And the drop shadow, in combination with the color of the font, with this gold trim and red letters, creates this blurring effect, and it makes it almost impossible to read this at first glance. Take away the drop shadow, which you can see on some of the French player aids, like for the core name or the core numbers and stuff on the French player aids. When you take away the drop shadow, it's fine, but you add that drop shadow and it creates this horrible blur that becomes almost impossible to read at a glance. So, and that's probably the biggest complaint most people will have about the components, even beyond the small core names on the counters, and the general records track and all that kind of stuff. People will probably mostly complain about that illegible font on the player aids. You get used to it after a while, and once you know where everything is, it doesn't really matter. But certainly, trying to learn the game, it's just kind of infuriating. The other big thing that people are going to be, especially people who are familiar with the Civil War, they're going to come in and see a 64-page rule book. And, they're going to think, I don't think the Civil War rule book was 64 pages. And I don't think it is. Probably closer to half that for the Civil War, maybe 30 pages. I forget exactly what it was. I guess we can find out. Actually number the pages in this? No, 50. Okay, so there's 54 pages, roughly, in the Civil War. So, this is no slouch in the rules department either. And, in some cases, these rules actually seem much denser. And, I still couldn't tell you what the naval rules are for this. So, but somehow, this system, and maybe not somehow, but I think I can tell you how, that Civil War system just feels more streamlined and simple. This feels like that system is there, it does all the same things, and you get used to it, certainly, but it feels like there's a lot more chrome. There's a lot more to the command system, with leader replacement, the Empire versus the Republic, various DRMs and things that are involved if you're in the Empire or the Republic. These are all things that are, things you have to remember, things which are on the player aid cards exhaustively, which is good, but they are burdens to, maintaining consistency as you play through in the system, and trying to remember all these little details. And they're great history-making details, but they create this burden on the player that I think anybody who's thinking, hey, Civil War, coming into this is going to find, wow, this seems like this is a lot heavier than what the Civil War was. And certainly the combat is. The combat has many more phases to it. Maybe not many more, but more phases to it because of the prevalence of much more advanced artillery. So you have this artillery phase that ends up, where you have to tally up all of your. So you have to do this calculation for strength points. Each army is worth strength points. Each corps is worth strength points, and then the strength points within those armies and corps are worth artillery strength points. So you have to do this calculation every time because your numbers will have changed the last time you fought due to casualties, and so you have to recalculate everything. And then on top of that, the artillery strength point calculations are different when you're in the Republic versus the Empire. So you start stacking these things on top of each other, and it starts to become this barrier to play. Now, if you have the fortitude to work your way through that stuff, I think the combat's very rewarding, and the system is very rewarding. But it's definitely going to be a problem, I think, for some people to deal with. There's no question. So once I dealt with that stuff, I rather enjoyed the game. I know one of Enrico's biggest complaints, and I keep making comparisons to Enrico because we were playing at the same time. His review was posted a couple days ago. I finally finished my game, and I'm posting a review now after having watched his, so I kind of know. And I watched his playthroughs, and so I know what he was the things that he had issues with. So I sort of keep contrasting to that because I think we both had high hopes for it. I think he ended up more frustrated and disappointed in the system than I did. I certainly had my frustrations, but I don't think I came away as disappointed as he did. And I've completely gotten off my train of thought wherever I was going. Let's just start over with something else. My overall thoughts are one of, yes, there's this frustration to it. There's frustration with the components. There's frustration with the heaviness of the system, the complexity of the movement rules and things like that. All of those were sort of difficult to deal with, but produced a game that started out interesting, but then quickly became apparent that the Prussians had some real problems in terms of trying to recreate the history. And some of that was addressed by a late, at least in my playthrough, late breaking rule change and errata that made the battle impact results calculated or resolved after you determine a victor. And I think that would have a fairly big impact at the beginning, in the earlier stages of the game, where the Prussian artillery is so heavily outmatches the French artillery. I think you would get some major French losses there, whereas in my playthrough I was getting French victories. You get French losses there and pulling thirds with that army, and now suddenly you've got the Empire falling earlier in the game. Whereas for me, it didn't fall until like turn 10 or something. It was very late in the game did the Empire finally fall, and that was only because I stupidly attacked with the French, thinking, oh hey, I've caught the Prussians out. I outnumbered them. They're not in fortifications, so I'm going to attack with the French. Well, I attack, I lose, fail the Empire die roll, and the Empire falls. But it fell late in the game. So when you have to make the strength point attrition die roll for every strength point in the French army to see if it stays or goes in converting to the Republic, I only failed on 6s, and so I can't imagine if you're rolling against a 2 or a 3 or something, the most of the French army would just vanish. So I certainly didn't have to deal with that, which was good. And I played the sort of main playthrough. There was scenario 2, which was the debacle, and this is like the whole historical campaign. And I think that maybe playing it again with this different rule might be a little more historical. But the way the game works is that there's such a disincentive to attack. especially for the Prussians with their poor leadership, they're almost always going to get killed on the battle impact rolls. And so that can result in a lot of losses where it feels like maybe they shouldn't be losing. And so the end result is you kind of don't want to attack. So in my case, both the armies just sat there and used the emergency strength point ability to just sink all their IPs into building more troops. And I don't feel like that was the intent of the designer, to kind of create this World War I-esque stalemate where nobody wants to attack and they just sit there building up their armies. And when they do attack, my armies were always built up before I would try attacking, and then I had this big bloody inconclusive fight, which might be historically accurate, but is not particularly entertaining, and ends up not feeling like the Franco-Prussian War turned out, where you had these big collapses and things like that. So, and a lot of this maneuvering and stuff. So, I tried doing maneuver, and indeed the Prussians did make it almost to Paris, but they just ran out of time. And I felt like there should have been a lot more core destruction particularly for the French, kind of what happened historically. But none of that ever happened because I never let any of my cores get very weak through this spinning IP points. So the turns would end up taking a long time because you're just kind of rolling dice for initiative, burning off a command point somewhere, making tiny adjustments to your lines, and then spending all the rest of your IPs building these troops. So. But whereas Enrico was like, I don't think I ever want to come back to this because it was just boring as shit. Just turn after turn of just building these strength points. Whereas I think I'd be interested in going back and playing opposed to see if first of all maybe I just sucked playing the Prussians, but also to see if playing against somebody would create more incentive to attack, make more of a game of chicken. Who's willing to attack instead of just building up their forces. Would it be, or maybe not attacking, but trying different maneuvers or things? If the attacking ends up weakening somebody too much. So it would just bring, I think, a different approach. See things from a different perspective, I think, to play it opposed. And the other thing I'm interested in revisiting with this is just trying some of the later scenarios to see the sort of historical part of the game that the designer was really going for. The designer wanted to see the siege of Paris and this desperate attempt by the French Republican forces to try and break the siege, which he found to be very dramatic and is never shown in games. All games usually have Mar-la-Tour or Sedan or the early moves in the war where the French collapse and everything, and it's the big sweeping movements from the Prussians, and then it's like, who cares about the siege? Foregone conclusion. And the designer's thesis for the whole game is that the siege of Paris was not a foregone conclusion. That it could have been, had the French forces, which, they get this big influx of crappy reserve infantry, yes, but this big influx of infantry, and they have these armies that are trying to break this siege. His view was that this was very dramatic, and it would be interesting to see. And so I think I would like to revisit it just to do the scenarios that start closer to the actual siege or when you're trying to break the siege. To me, that would be interesting. I have still enough interest in this particular system, this particular design, to see that, to see what the designer intended. Despite my misgivings about the advantage of the French command, the fact that I didn't feel like the French artillery it felt like it ended up going toe-to-toe with the Prussians by the end. But again, I think this rule change will help, or the rule clarification will help of stipulating when you're doing the victor determination before doing the battle impact. I think that will result in some French losses where there should have been wins, while the French are under that artillery time fuse penalty. Once that penalty goes away, then it becomes tougher because the French artillery gets better, and in the Republic it gets even better. So, it behooves the Prussians early in the game to attack, while the French have that artillery time fuse modifier that hobbles their artillery, where the Prussians can add that extra demoralization to a combat that. The casualty chart generally would involve casualties being pretty equal. And so the Prussians, or the combat chart, the CRT, ends up with a largely equal casualties usually, depending on the size of the forces fighting. And so for the Prussians, where they can make up that strength point loss differential is with their artillery. That's where they could also get that extra demoralization. So I think that would create another. Playing it through with that from the start might create a more interesting situation. So ultimately, I am still interested in trying this out. Could I recommend it to somebody who liked the Civil War? I don't think so. If you liked the elegance and fairly streamlined command structure in the Civil War, and the movement and everything is fairly simple in the Civil War. Again, naval rules are the exception there. If you like that, this game does not. It does not feel that streamlined, and the rule book is huge, but that's because they put in every edge case. And I will say the rules on this are actually very good. This is a very good rule book. I never had trouble finding anything, which is my biggest pet peeve for rules usually. Very simple to find things in here, very clearly explained, but they are so long because of every edge case they put in. They were exhausted in putting every edge case in there, which is good, but it becomes a big barrier to entry to kind of work your way through all this. It seems overwhelming at first. So that's why I can't really recommend it to somebody who's looking for something as elegant or streamlined as Victor Games Civil War. I think you have to really have an interest in the Franco-Prussian War to want to approach this, or to be willing to approach this. So I can definitely say that I think the hobby needed a Franco-Prussian War game like this. I don't know if the hobby wants a Franco-Prussian War game like this, but it definitely fills a much needed hole. And I think it is probably, and I can't speak with authority here because I don't think I've actually played any other Franco-Prussian War games. In fact, the only one I can think of is the Strategy and Tactics one, which I think is a redo of the old original SPI Franco-Prussian War, flat pack game from the 70s. But I've got a copy of the S&T, and I may have to approach that soon just to try and compare it to this. But and I think there's a Paper Wars Franco-Prussian game, but it's just on Marlatour, I think. And there's another, I think Victory Point Games did a Franco-Prussian War 40. In fact, I think Enrico did a playthrough and review of that and found it lacking. But I could say, even having not played those, that this probably is the definitive game on the Franco-Prussian War for the hobby, because I don't think any of those other games have the level of detail that this has in terms of command structure and things like that. Because I think the Strategy and Tactics ones is operational, but I know you're not dealing with this whole pile of specific named commanders, and it's and the reaction movement and all that kind of stuff in the combat. I'm sure, since given it's a magazine game, is not going to be at the level of detail that this is at. So certainly, I would say this is probably the most detailed. I don't know if it's the definitive, but it feels like it, just because of everything that you get in here. And there are quite a few different scenarios at all different stages of the war. Even a hypothetical one where it starts before the original battle, the actual historical battle started with, and considers a greater French mobilization. And that one was titled "On to Berlin?" ? Meaning that there the French have a good chance of counter thrusting and hitting the Prussians just as heavily. So ultimately recommended, but for serious devotees of the Franco-Prussian War only. Probably not for anyone looking for something casual, or maybe not casual, but for even something that's not particularly heavy. I would say if you want to play Franco-Prussian War, probably try the Strategy and Tactics game first, then approach this if you really want something heavy. But if you've played your fair share of monster games and are a big grognard, and even if you don't have an interest in the Franco-Prussian War, then this might just be a challenge for you from the grognard standpoint. So anyway, there we have it. Send this one.